Welcome, dear listeners, to another gentle journey through the flowing rivers of history. Tonight, we drift slowly back through time to the early years of the 20th century, to an age when the world stood balanced on the delicate threshold of profound and irreversible change. This is the story of the Great War, what we now remember as World War I, and how a continent that had known the sweet peace of relative tranquility for nearly half a century gradually awakened to find itself caught in an intricate web of its own careful making. As you settle into your quiet, comfortable space this evening, let your breathing grow slow and deep, and allow your mind to wander peacefully across the landscapes of memory. We begin our gentle tale not with the harsh thunder of cannons or the violent clash of armies, but with the softer, more comforting sounds of a world at peace, the rhythmic clip-clop of horses' hooves on smooth cobblestone streets, the distant melodic whistle of steam trains carrying passengers across borders that seemed as permanent as the mountains themselves, the quiet murmur of thoughtful conversations in Vienna's elegant coffee-houses, where intellectuals in fine wool coats debated the future of art and empire over steaming cups of rich, dark coffee. The year is 1900, and Europe appears to be entering what many thoughtful observers would later call a golden age of human civilization. The continent spreads before us like a complex, beautiful tapestry, a patchwork of great empires and emerging nations, each with its own cherished dreams and noble ambitions, yet all bound together by an intricate web of relationships, some warm and friendly, others tinged with the shadows of ancient rivalries, all delicately balanced, like the most complex and precise piece of clockwork ever created by human hands. In the very heart of Central Europe, the ancient Austro-Hungarian Empire stretches majestically from the snow-capped Italian Alps to the rolling Carpathian Mountains, from the fertile Czech plains where golden wheat waves in summer breezes to the sparkling shores of the blue Adriatic Sea. It is an empire of the most extraordinary diversity, a place where the melodic German language mingles harmoniously with the passionate Hungarian tongue, where the soft sounds of Czech blend with the musical notes of Croatian, where Polish conversations flow alongside Italian discussions in the same comfortable cafe. Emperor Franz Joseph I, a dignified gentleman with his distinctive white whiskers and proud military bearing, has ruled wisely from his magnificent palace in Vienna for over 50 peaceful years. His empire is old and dignified, steeped in centuries of tradition, yet increasingly aware of the gentle winds of changing times that blow across the European continent. To the north and east, the dynamic German Empire pulses with remarkable industrial energy and modern innovation. Kaiser Wilhelm II, the beloved grandson of Britain's revered Queen Victoria, presides with enthusiasm over a nation that has transformed itself in just a few remarkable decades from a loose collection of small independent states into Europe's most powerful and productive industrial force. The bustling cities of the Ruhr Valley echo day and night with the steady sound of modern machinery, while in the beautiful capital of Berlin, broad tree-lined boulevards showcase the quiet confidence of a nation that has found its proud place in the warming sun of European civilization. German universities attract the brightest and most eager students from across the entire German-speaking world, German science leads the way in chemistry and engineering, and German culture, from Wagner's magnificent operas to the immortal writings of Goethe, commands deep respect and admiration throughout the educated world. Further east, across vast, seemingly endless plains where golden wheat fields stretch unbroken to the distant horizon, lies the immense Russian Empire, the largest continuous landmass on our entire Earth. Tsar Nicholas II, a gentle soul with kind, thoughtful eyes, who would much rather have been a peaceful country gentleman than an absolute autocrat, rules with a heavy heart over this enormous domain. From the cold Baltic shores, where fishing boats bob gently in morning mists, to the distant Pacific Ocean, where the sun sets each evening in brilliant colors. From the frozen Arctic tundra, where reindeer roam freely, to the warm borders of Afghanistan, where ancient trade routes wind through mountain passes, his vast domain encompasses 1/6 of all the land surface on our planet. Yet this immense empire moves slowly and deliberately, like a great sailing ship navigating calm waters, its gentle pace set by the timeless rhythm of rural life and the eternal turning of the seasons that has governed Russian life for countless generations. To the west, across the narrow English Channel, where white-capped waves dance in the morning sunlight, Great Britain continues its quiet, dignified mastery of the world's seas. King Edward VII, known throughout Europe for his love of refined pleasure and skilled diplomacy, presides with wisdom over a global empire on which, as they proudly say, the sun never sets. British merchant ships carry precious goods to every corner of the globe. British banks provide financing for ambitious projects, from the construction of railways in distant Argentina to the development of diamond mines in far-off South Africa. And the powerful Royal Navy maintains what they call the Pax Britannica, the British peace that has kept the world's vital sea lanes open for peaceful commerce and trade. France, still beautiful and culturally vibrant, despite the painful scars of recent military defeats, has found renewed confidence and purpose under the progressive Third Republic. The deep wounds of 1870 and the bitter loss of the beloved provinces of Alsace-Lorraine to German forces have not yet healed completely, but they have been covered over by remarkable achievements in art, literature, and scientific discovery. Paris remains without question the cultural capital of all Europe, a magical city where talented artists from around the world come to study their craft and create works of lasting beauty. The elegant Eiffel Tower, erected with great fanfare for a World's Fair just over a decade earlier, stands tall and proud as a powerful symbol of French ingenuity and the nation's firm determination to remain relevant and influential in a rapidly changing world. These great powers do not stand alone in splendid isolation on the European stage. Italy, recently unified after centuries of division and eager to claim its rightful place among the respected European family of nations, stretches gracefully from the majestic Alps, where eagles soar, to the sun-warmed island of Sicily, where olive groves flourish. The ancient Ottoman Empire, though much reduced from its former magnificent glory, still controls the vital crossroads between Europe and Asia, its historic capital Constantinople standing as a proud guardian of the strategic passage between the Black Sea and the blue Mediterranean. In the complex Balkans, small but proud nations like Serbia, Bulgaria, and Montenegro carefully nurse their own particular ambitions and dreams of greatness, while the intricate ethnic complexities of this mountainous region create a delicate balance that requires constant, careful diplomatic attention from the great powers. As the bright new century dawns with hope and promise, these various nations find themselves connected by an increasingly complex and sophisticated network of alliances and formal agreements. Like elegant dancers at a grand formal ball, each nation moves gracefully in careful relation to the others, following diplomatic steps that have been painstakingly choreographed over long decades of patient negotiation and compromise. The music that guides this intricate international dance is the universal desire for security and peace, the fundamental need to protect vital national interests, and the ancient, enduring hope that by carefully balancing power against power, lasting peace might be preserved for future generations. The solid foundation of this careful system rests firmly on two great alliance structures that have emerged gradually from the complex diplomatic maneuvering of the late 19th century. On one side stands the Triple Alliance, formally established in 1882, linking the German Empire, Austria-Hungary, and Italy in a defensive military pact designed to preserve the peace. Otto von Bismarck, the legendary Iron Chancellor, who had skillfully unified Germany through three swift but decisive wars in the 1860s and 1870s, had crafted this alliance with the careful precision and attention to detail of a master clockmaker. His simple but profound goal was to ensure that France, still smarting and resentful from its humiliating defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, would never again be able to threaten German security or European stability. The brilliant Bismarck understood with crystal clarity that Germany's central position in the heart of Europe made it vulnerable to potential attack from multiple directions simultaneously. By allying closely with Austria-Hungary, Germany secured its vital southern flank and gained a reliable partner that shared its growing concern about Russian expansion and influence in the volatile Balkans. The careful addition of Italy completed this strategic triangle, providing additional security along Germany's southern approaches and ensuring that France would face potential enemies on two dangerous fronts should it ever contemplate seeking revenge for past defeats. Yet alliances, like all living things in nature, evolve and change over time in response to new circumstances. When the impulsive Kaiser Wilhelm II dismissed the cautious Bismarck in 1890, dramatically declaring that he wished to be his own chancellor and guide German policy personally, the careful balance that the old diplomat had so skillfully maintained began to shift in dangerous ways. Wilhelm was energetic and enthusiastic, but also impulsive and increasingly convinced that Germany deserved a much more prominent and respected place in world affairs. His fateful decision not to renew the secret reinsurance treaty with Russia created a dangerous diplomatic opening that France was remarkably quick to recognize and exploit to its own advantage. The Franco-Russian alliance, formally established in 1894 after years of careful negotiation, might have seemed highly unlikely to casual observers of European politics. Republican France, with its democratic ideals, and autocratic Russia, with its ancient traditions of absolute monarchy, had very little in common politically or culturally, but they shared a growing concern about German power and ambition. French loans helped finance crucial Russian industrial development projects, while Russian promises of military support gave France the confidence and security it needed to stand up firmly to German pressure and intimidation. This alliance fundamentally transformed the European balance of power, creating the very dangerous situation that Bismarck had worked so hard and skillfully to prevent. The distinct possibility that Germany might face determined enemies on both its eastern and western borders simultaneously. Britain, the great maritime power whose naval supremacy had dominated the world's oceans for generations, had traditionally remained carefully aloof from continental entanglements, following a policy they called splendid isolation. The powerful Royal Navy was so dominant that Britain felt completely secure from any possible invasion, while its vast global empire provided both profitable markets and essential resources that made European alliances seem unnecessary for British security. Yet, as the promising new century progressed steadily forward, even proud Britain began to feel the growing need for reliable friends and allies. The first serious crack in British isolation came with the mounting German naval challenge that began to threaten British maritime supremacy. Kaiser Wilhelm II had become absolutely fascinated with sea power and naval strategy, deeply influenced by the influential writings of American naval theorist Alfred Thayer Mahan, who argued persuasively that great nations must inevitably have great navies to protect their interests. The ambitious German naval laws of 1898 and 1900 publicly announced Germany's firm intention to build a powerful fleet that could effectively challenge British naval supremacy on the high seas. Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, the capable architect of German naval expansion, spoke confidently of creating a risk fleet that would make Britain think twice before opposing legitimate German ambitions around the world. This accelerating naval competition created ripples of concern that spread far beyond the busy dockyards of Portsmouth and Kiel, where the great ships were built. British leaders began to worry seriously that their splendid isolation might gradually become dangerous isolation that could threaten the empire's security. If Germany could successfully threaten British control of the seas, then Britain urgently needed reliable allies who could help contain German power on land while Britain maintained its naval supremacy. The first crucial step came with the historic Entente Cordiale signed with France in 1904 after months of careful negotiation. This was not a formal military alliance, but rather a comprehensive agreement to resolve long-standing colonial disputes and coordinate foreign policy in areas of mutual interest. Britain graciously recognized French interests in Morocco, while France acknowledged British control in strategically important Egypt. More importantly for the future, the two nations began to discuss the possibility of military cooperation should either face unprovoked aggression from hostile powers. 3 years later, Britain extended this diplomatic revolution by reaching a similar agreement with Russia after generations of rivalry and suspicion. The Anglo-Russian Entente of 1907 successfully resolved long-standing and potentially dangerous disputes over Persia, Afghanistan, and Tibet that had threatened to bring the two empires into conflict. Like the French agreement, this was not a formal alliance, but it created the essential framework for future cooperation between two great powers that had been rivals and competitors for most of the 19th century. These carefully negotiated agreements created what became known throughout Europe as the Triple Entente, linking Britain, France, and Russia in an informal but increasingly close relationship that would shape the future of European politics. Europe now found itself clearly divided into two great camps, each watching the other with growing suspicion and mutual distrust, and each side becoming increasingly convinced that the other harbored secret aggressive intentions that threatened the peace. Yet despite these growing tensions beneath the surface, daily life in these early years of the century continued with remarkable normalcy and prosperity. The great capitals of Europe buzzed with extraordinary cultural activity and intellectual ferment. In beautiful Vienna, the brilliant young Sigmund Freud was developing his revolutionary theories of the human mind and the unconscious, while talented artists like Gustav Klimt created breathtaking works that challenged traditional notions of beauty and artistic expression. The city's famous coffee houses remained important centers of intellectual discussion and debate, elegant gathering places where writers, composers, and politicians met regularly to discuss the pressing issues of the day over cups of strong coffee and delicate pastries prepared by skilled chefs. Berlin had rapidly become a major center of scientific research and learning, its prestigious universities attracting the brightest minds from across the entire German-speaking world. The city's broad, impressive boulevards, carefully planned and built during the prosperous reign of Wilhelm I, showcased the quiet confidence of a nation that had achieved political unification and remarkable economic prosperity within living memory. Elegant department stores displayed beautiful goods from around the world, while grand theaters presented both beloved classical works and the latest experimental dramas that pushed the boundaries of artistic expression. Paris continued to set the exacting standards of fashion and culture that were eagerly followed throughout the civilized world. The city's renowned art galleries displayed the revolutionary works of the Impressionists, who had completely transformed painting by capturing the subtle effects of light and atmosphere in ways never before attempted. The annual salons remained important events in the international cultural calendar, drawing visitors from across Europe, while the famous cabarets of Montmartre provided entertainment that pushed the boundaries of social respectability and challenged conventional morality. London, unquestionably the financial center of the entire world, pulsed with remarkable commercial energy and entrepreneurial spirit. The city's great banks financed ambitious projects ranging from the construction of railways in distant Argentina to the development of gold mines in far-off South Africa. The busy port of London remained one of the most active in the world, its extensive docks filled day and night with ships carrying valuable goods to and from every corner of the vast globe. Meanwhile, the magnificent country houses of the aristocracy maintained their gracious traditions of elegant living, their carefully tended gardens and manicured lawns, providing peaceful retreats from the increasing bustle of modern urban life. Yet beneath this attractive surface of prosperity and cultural achievement, thoughtful observers could detect disturbing signs of growing international tension and competition. The arms race that had begun with the German naval challenge was steadily accelerating year by year. Each passing year brought news of larger and more powerful battleships, more destructive artillery, and increasingly sophisticated military technology that made previous weapons seem obsolete. The German high seas fleet grew steadily in size and capability, while Britain responded with its revolutionary dreadnought battleships that made all previous warships completely obsolete overnight and forced other nations to begin building entirely new fleets. On land, the major powers systematically expanded their armies and refined their complex mobilization plans with scientific precision. Germany's famous Schlieffen Plan, developed by the methodical Count Alfred von Schlieffen in the years before his retirement in 1906, called for a rapid, decisive offensive through neutral Belgium to defeat France completely before Russia could fully mobilize its vast armies for war. The plan was based on careful calculations of railway timetables and mobilization schedules, reflecting the extent to which modern warfare had become primarily a matter of industrial logistics and organizational efficiency, as much as traditional military strategy and battlefield tactics. France developed its own Plan 17, which called for an immediate, aggressive offensive into the lost provinces of Alsace-Lorraine to reclaim these territories from German control. French military doctrine emphasized the supreme importance of offensive spirit and the absolute need to carry any future war onto enemy territory as quickly as possible. Russian military planners worked diligently to improve their mobilization procedures, knowing that their country's vast size and limited railway network put them at a serious disadvantage in any race to get forces to the frontier quickly enough to be effective. Yet these extensive military preparations were viewed by most contemporary observers as prudent precautions rather than preparations for imminent war. The balance of power seemed stable and secure. Diplomacy continued to resolve international disputes peacefully, and growing economic prosperity created powerful incentives for continued peaceful cooperation. Trade between the major powers continued to expand steadily, with German manufactured goods flowing to Britain and France, while British capital helped finance important development projects in Germany and Russia that benefited all parties. The year 1913 seemed to confirm that this optimistic assessment was entirely correct. The major powers successfully managed several potentially dangerous international crises without resort to war. The Balkan Wars of 1912 to 1913, in which the small nations of southeastern Europe fought first against the declining Ottoman Empire and then among themselves over territorial disputes, might easily have drawn in the great powers. But careful diplomacy and mutual restraint prevented these regional conflicts from spreading beyond their original boundaries. Indeed, the great powers worked together constructively to establish an independent Albania and to mediate complex disputes over territorial boundaries that could have led to wider conflict. The Conference of London, which met regularly to settle Balkan questions, demonstrated clearly that the alliance system could still function effectively as a mechanism for preserving peace rather than preparing for war. As winter gradually gave way to spring in 1914, there seemed little reason for anyone to believe that this careful system of balanced tensions would not continue indefinitely into the future. The newspapers reported on their usual mixture of political developments, cultural events, and social gossip that interested their readers. In Britain, the main political excitement concerned the controversial question of Irish Home Rule and the growing movement for women's suffrage. German newspapers focused primarily on impressive industrial expansion and colonial developments in Africa. French journalists wrote extensively about the latest fashions and artistic movements that originated in Paris, while Russian papers discussed the slow but steady progress of political reform under the Tsarist system. Yet it was in the most politically unstable region of Europe, the volatile Balkans, that the spark would come that would ignite the great conflagration that would consume the continent. The Austro-Hungarian Empire's controversial decision to annex Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1908 had created lasting resentment among South Slavs who dreamed passionately of uniting all their people in a single, independent nation. Serbia, having gained complete independence from Ottoman rule and expanded its territory significantly in the recent Balkan Wars, increasingly saw itself as the natural leader of this pan-Slavic movement that threatened to destabilize the entire region. The growing tension between Austrian imperial ambitions and Serbian nationalist dreams created an extremely dangerous situation in which small incidents could potentially have large and unpredictable consequences. Secret societies dedicated to South Slavic unity operated across the region with increasing boldness, while Austrian authorities struggled desperately to maintain control over populations that increasingly looked to Belgrade rather than Vienna for political and cultural leadership. It was in this tense context that Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the ancient Austro-Hungarian throne, planned an official visit to Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina, in late June 1914. The visit was carefully intended as a gesture of imperial presence and authority, a way of demonstrating that the Habsburg dynasty remained firmly committed to its Balkan provinces, despite growing nationalist agitation. The Archduke would attend impressive military maneuvers with the Austro-Hungarian army, tour the historic city, and show himself to his future subjects in a display of imperial grandeur and continuity. Franz Ferdinand was, in many important ways, an unlikely figure to become the unwitting catalyst for world war. At 50 years of age, he was a thoughtful, cultured man who had shown consistently more interest in art and travel than in military affairs or imperial politics. His controversial marriage to Sophie Chotek, a Czech countess who was considered beneath his elevated station by court protocol, had demonstrated his willingness to follow his heart rather than rigid dynastic expectations. The couple had found genuine happiness together and were devoted, loving parents to their 3 young children. The Archduke had also shown considerably more understanding of the empire's complex ethnic problems than many of his conservative contemporaries. He had seriously proposed transforming the existing dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary into a triple monarchy that would give much greater autonomy to the South Slavs within the empire. Such a far-reaching reform might have satisfied many of the nationalist aspirations that were causing dangerous tension in the Balkans, though it would have significantly reduced Serbia's potential role as the leader of South Slavic unity. The decision to visit Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, was particularly provocative and poorly timed, because this specific date held special religious and historical significance for Serbian nationalists throughout the region. It was Vidovdan, Saintun Vitus Day, commemorating the tragic Battle of Kosovo in 1389, when Serbian forces had been decisively defeated by the expanding Ottoman Empire in a battle that marked the end of Serbian independence for centuries. For Serbian patriots throughout the Balkans, this was a solemn day of mourning and remembrance, hardly an appropriate time for an Austrian archduke to make a ceremonial visit to a South Slavic city. The security arrangements for the visit reflected the casual confidence of an empire that had faced no serious internal challenges for many decades. The Archduke and his beloved wife would ride in an open automobile through the crowded streets of Sarajevo, protected by only a modest contingent of local police and a few imperial security officers. The planned route was published in advance in local newspapers, and crowds were actively encouraged to line the streets to welcome their future emperor in a display of imperial loyalty. What the Austrian authorities did not know, and couldn't have imagined, was that a small group of young South Slavic nationalists had been planning an assassination attempt for several weeks. The group, which called itself the Black Hand, was led by a passionate 19-year-old Bosnian Serb named Gavrilo Princip. Despite his youth, Princip was thin, pale, and already suffering from tuberculosis, but he was also deeply and passionately committed to the cause of South Slavic independence from Austrian rule. He and 6 dedicated companions had spent weeks carefully preparing for the Archduke's visit, obtaining weapons and explosives from sympathetic Serbian military officers, and planning their desperate attack with meticulous attention to detail. The morning of June 28th dawned bright, sunny, and pleasantly warm in the historic city of Sarajevo. The narrow, winding streets were festively decorated with Austrian flags and formal portraits of the imperial family. Curious crowds gathered along the announced route, a mixture of the genuinely curious, the politically loyal, and those who hoped to witness history in the making. The Archduke and his wife, dressed respectively in a formal military uniform and an elegant white dress, seemed relaxed and confident as they began their ceremonial tour of the city in the bright morning sunshine. The first attempt on their lives came as their slow-moving motorcade travelled along the tree-lined Apel Quay beside the gently flowing Miljacka River. One of the determined conspirators threw a powerful bomb at the Archduke's car, but the device bounced harmlessly off the folded back hood and exploded loudly under the following vehicle, wounding several military officers and some innocent spectators. The Archduke and his wife were completely unharmed, though understandably shaken by the sudden, violent incident that had disrupted their peaceful morning. After completing their planned activities, including a formal reception at City Hall, where the Archduke spoke graciously about the warm welcome they had received from the people of Sarajevo, Franz Ferdinand made a compassionate decision to visit the officers who had been wounded in the bomb attack. This humanitarian gesture required a change in the planned route through the city, but unfortunately, the driver of the lead car was not properly informed of the important alteration to their schedule. As the motorcade made its way slowly through the historic city streets, the lead car took a wrong turn onto Franz Joseph Street. When officials suddenly realized the mistake, they quickly ordered the driver to stop and reverse direction to get back on the correct route. It was at this precise moment, as the Archduke's car paused directly in front of a small delicatessen, that fate intervened in the form of Gavrilo Princip. The young assassin had given up hope after the failure of the morning bomb attack and was walking dejectedly along the street when he suddenly found himself within just a few feet of his intended target. Drawing a pistol, he fired 2 quick shots at close range. The first bullet struck the Archduke in the neck, while the second hit Sophie in the abdomen. Both wounds proved fatal, though the couple lived long enough to be rushed to the governor's residence, where they died within the hour. Their children now orphaned by this act of political violence. The immediate reaction to the shocking assassination was intense shock and outrage throughout the Austro-Hungarian Empire and much of Europe. Franz Ferdinand had been widely respected as a moderate voice who might have helped solve the empire's complex ethnic problems through peaceful reform. His sudden, violent death removed one of the few Habsburg archdukes who truly understood the urgent need for constitutional reform and political compromise with growing nationalist aspirations. Yet the initial response from the other major European capitals was relatively calm and measured. Assassinations of political figures were unfortunately not unknown in the early 20th century, and there seemed no compelling reason why this tragic incident should lead inevitably to a general European war. The French president was visiting Russia on a state visit. British attention was focused primarily on the contentious Irish question, and German leaders were more concerned with domestic political issues than with complex Balkan affairs. It was the Austrian response that began to transform a tragic regional incident into a continental crisis of unprecedented proportions. The government in Vienna, led by Foreign Minister Leopold Berchtold, and urged on by military leaders who believed that the empire's prestige and credibility required a strong response, decided that the assassination provided a perfect opportunity to settle accounts with Serbia once and for all. The evidence linking the assassins to Serbian military and intelligence services was circumstantially strong, though it did not prove conclusively that the Serbian government had directly ordered the attack or even known about it in advance. Nevertheless, Austrian leaders convinced themselves that Serbia was ultimately responsible and that only a decisive military response would restore the empire's credibility and authority in the volatile Balkans. The key to Austrian planning was securing firm German support for whatever action they might decide to take. Without German backing, Austria-Hungary could not risk a war that might bring mighty Russia to Serbia's defense. On July 5th, exactly 1 week after the assassination, Austrian envoys met with Kaiser Wilhelm II and his principal advisers to seek assurance of German support for any action they might take. Wilhelm's response, which historians would later call the infamous blank check, proved to be one of the most fateful decisions in all of European history. The Kaiser assured the Austrians that they could count on Germany's full support, whatever action they decided to take against Serbia. German leaders, including Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, believed confidently that the crisis would remain localized and that Russia would not dare intervene on Serbia's behalf given its internal weakness. This crucial calculation was based on the assumption that Russia, still recovering slowly from its humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War and the traumatic 1905 revolution, was in no condition to fight a major European war. German leaders also believed that France and Britain would have no interest in supporting Russia in a conflict over Balkan issues that did not directly threaten their own vital interests. Armed with firm German support, the Austrian government began preparing a comprehensive ultimatum to Serbia that was deliberately designed to be unacceptable to any sovereign nation. The document, which took nearly 3 weeks to prepare with legal precision, contained 10 sweeping demands that would have effectively reduced Serbia to an Austrian protectorate. Serbian officials would be required to suppress all anti-Austrian publications and organizations, dismiss all officers and officials deemed hostile to Austria-Hungary, and allow Austrian representatives to participate directly in the investigation of the assassination conspiracy. The ultimatum was formally delivered to the Serbian government on July 23rd, with a firm demand for a complete reply within 48 hours. The timing was carefully chosen to coincide with the state visit of French President Raymond Poincaré to St. Petersburg, which meant that France and Russia could not immediately coordinate their response to this sudden crisis. Serbia's reply, delivered just before the deadline on July 25th, was a masterpiece of diplomatic skill and political maneuvering. The Serbian government accepted most of the Austrian demands, but firmly rejected those that would have violated Serbian sovereignty, particularly the requirement that Austrian officials participate in judicial proceedings on Serbian soil. The response was carefully crafted to appear reasonable to international opinion, while maintaining Serbian independence and dignity. The Serbian reply might have provided a solid basis for negotiation and compromise, but Austrian leaders had already decided that only war would serve their purposes and restore their prestige. On July the 25th, the same day they received Serbia's response, Austrian officials ordered the mobilization of their forces and began active preparations to declare war. News of the Austrian ultimatum and Serbian reply created the first serious alarm in the other European capitals. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Sazonov declared that Russia could not allow Serbia to be destroyed, while French leaders assured their Russian allies of French support. British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey began urgent diplomatic efforts to convene a conference of the major powers to resolve the crisis peacefully. Yet the mechanisms of alliance diplomacy were already beginning to operate with mechanical precision. Russian military leaders advised Tsar Nicholas II that any delay in mobilization would put Russia at a fatal disadvantage in a war with Germany and Austria-Hungary. French generals gave similar advice to their government, pointing out that Russia's support was essential to French security. German military planners, observing the diplomatic crisis unfold, began to worry that delay would only strengthen their potential enemies. The Schlieffen Plan required absolute precision in timing, and any postponement of military action would allow Russia additional time to mobilize its vast armies. On July 28th, exactly 1 month after the assassination in Sarajevo, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The declaration was intended as the beginning of a limited conflict that would settle Austro-Serbian relations without involving the other great powers. Instead, it marked the beginning of the end for the old European order. The Russian response came swiftly. Tsar Nicholas II, despite his personal reluctance to go to war, authorized the mobilization of Russian forces in the military districts facing Austria-Hungary. This partial mobilization was intended as a show of support for Serbia while avoiding direct provocation of Germany. However, Russian military leaders soon convinced the Tsar that partial mobilization was technically impossible. The Russian mobilization plan was designed as a single, comprehensive operation that could not be easily modified. On July 30th, Nicholas II authorized general mobilization of all Russian forces, a decision that made a general European war virtually inevitable. German leaders had long maintained that Russian mobilization would be considered an act of war, since the Schlieffen Plan required Germany to defeat France before Russian forces could reach the German frontier. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia and began mobilizing its own forces according to the carefully prepared timetables. The German ultimatum to France, demanding that France remain neutral in a Russo-German war, was rejected by the French government, which honored its alliance obligations to Russia. On August 3rd, Germany declared war on France and began implementing the Schlieffen Plan with an invasion of Belgium. The violation of Belgian neutrality, which had been guaranteed by international treaty since 1839, provided the British government with the justification it needed to enter the war. Prime Minister H. Asquith and Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey had been reluctant to commit Britain to a continental war, but the invasion of Belgium created a casus belli that united British public opinion behind military intervention. On August 4, 1914, Britain declared war on Germany, making the conflict truly global as the British Empire's enormous resources were automatically committed to the struggle. What had begun as a regional dispute in the remote Balkans had become a world war in just over a month. The speed with which Europe slid from peace to war shocked contemporary observers and has continued to puzzle historians ever since. The alliance system that was supposed to preserve peace by balancing power had instead created a situation in which local conflicts could escalate into general war with frightening rapidity. Yet there was also something almost inevitable about the process once it began. The mobilization timetables, alliance obligations, and military plans created a momentum that proved impossible to stop. Diplomats found themselves overwhelmed by the pace of events, while military leaders argued that any delay would be fatal to their nation's security. The peoples of Europe greeted the outbreak of war with a complex mixture of emotions that historians have struggled to capture accurately. In the major capitals, enthusiastic crowds gathered to cheer the mobilization orders and sing stirring patriotic songs. Young men rushed to enlist, convinced that the war would be brief and glorious. The famous prediction that the soldiers would be home before the leaves fall reflected a widespread belief that modern warfare would be decided quickly by decisive battles. Yet there were also quieter, more thoughtful voices that expressed serious foreboding about what was to come. In the German Reichstag, the Social Democratic Party voted for war credits, despite their international socialist principles. But their leader, Hugo Haas, spoke soberly of entering a difficult path with an anxious heart. French socialist Jean Jaurès, who had worked tirelessly for peace, was assassinated by a nationalist fanatic who believed that opposition to war was treason. The initial military operations proceeded according to the carefully prepared plans that had been refined over years of staff college exercises and war games. In the West, German forces crossed the Belgian frontier on August 4th and began their great wheeling movement toward Paris. The Belgian army, though hopelessly outnumbered, offered fierce resistance that delayed the German advance and provided precious time for French and British forces to deploy. The fortress city of Liège, guarding the vital passage between the Ardennes and the Meuse River, held out for 12 days despite bombardment by enormous German siege guns. The heroic defense of Liège became an inspiring symbol of Belgian resistance and demonstrated that the German timetable was already falling behind schedule. Meanwhile, French forces launched their own offensive into Alsace-Lorraine according to Plan 17th. The early attacks achieved some success, with French troops briefly recapturing the symbolic cities of Mulhouse and Altkirch. Church bells rang throughout Paris to celebrate these first victories, and newspapers spoke confidently of the rapid liberation of the lost provinces. However, German counterattacks soon drove the French forces back across the frontier, and it became clear that the offensive into Alsace-Lorraine had achieved little beyond diverting French forces from the main theatre of operations in Belgium and northern France. The British Expeditionary Force, though small by continental standards, with only 4 infantry divisions and 1 cavalry division, represented the most professional army in Europe. These were long-service soldiers who had learned their trade in colonial campaigns from South Africa to India. Their marksmanship was so accurate that German forces often mistook rifle fire for machine gun fire. The BEF took its position on the left flank of the French line, near the Belgian city of Mons. On August 23rd, they fought their first major engagement of the war against advance elements of the German First Army. The Battle of Mons was a tactical victory for the British, whose rifle fire inflicted heavy casualties on attacking German forces. However, the retreat of French forces on their right flank forced the British to begin a withdrawal that would continue for 2 weeks. The retreat from Mons became one of the great marches in British military history, as exhausted soldiers fell back day after day under the blazing August sun, fighting rear-guard actions while German forces pressed their pursuit. As German armies approached Paris, the French government prepared to evacuate the capital. Government offices were moved to Bordeaux, and many Parisians fled southward in panic. The German advance seemed unstoppable, and it appeared that the Schlieffen Plan might achieve its objective of defeating France within 6 weeks. Yet the very success of the German advance began to create problems that its planners had not fully anticipated. The long march through Belgium and northern France exhausted German troops and stretched supply lines to the breaking point. Communications between army headquarters and field commanders became increasingly difficult, while the need to garrison conquered territory reduced the forces available for the final assault on Paris. Meanwhile, Russian mobilization proceeded more rapidly than German planners had expected. By late August, 2 Russian armies were advancing into East Prussia, forcing Germany to transfer forces from the Western Front to deal with this unexpected threat. The Battle of Tannenberg, fought from August 26th to 30th, saw German forces under Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff achieve a spectacular victory over the Russian Second Army, capturing over 90,000 prisoners and establishing reputations that would make both men heroes in Germany. However, the victory came at the cost of troops that might have been decisive in the final push toward Paris. The turning point in the West came in early September, when French Commander-in-Chief Joseph Joffre recognized that the German advance was beginning to lose momentum. The German First Army, commanded by Alexander von Kluck, had wheeled eastward short of Paris, exposing its flank to forces gathered in the French capital. The Battle of the Marne, fought from September 6th to 12th, marked the failure of the Schlieffen Plan and the beginning of a new kind of warfare. French and British forces attacked the exposed German flank, while other armies launched coordinated offensives all along the line. The German retreat that followed, though conducted in good order, marked the end of the war of movement in the West. Both sides now began what became known as the Race to the Sea, a series of attempts to outflank each other's northern flank that extended the trench lines from the Swiss border to the English Channel. By November 1914, a continuous line of fortifications stretched across northern France and Belgium, creating a deadlock that would persist for the next 4 years. The transition from mobile warfare to trench warfare happened gradually, almost imperceptibly. Exhausted soldiers began digging shallow scrapes in the ground for protection from enemy fire. These temporary shelters were gradually expanded and connected, creating communication trenches that allowed safe movement between different positions. What began as expedient field fortifications gradually evolved into elaborate defensive systems. The frontline trenches were backed by support trenches and reserve positions, all connected by communication trenches that allowed troops and supplies to move safely. Barbed wire obstacles protected the approaches to the trenches, while machine gun nests provided covering fire. The development of this vast defensive network transformed the nature of warfare itself. The Western Front became a continuous line of fortifications stretching over 400 miles from the North Sea to the Swiss border. This line was not merely a single trench, but rather a complex system of defensive positions that could extend several miles in depth. The frontline trenches, where soldiers lived and fought, were typically 6 to 8 feet deep and protected by thick parapets of earth and sandbags. These trenches followed a zigzag pattern that prevented enemy forces from firing straight down their length if they captured a section. Every few hundred yards, the trenches turned at sharp angles, creating what were called traverses that limited the damage from shell explosions. Behind the frontline trenches lay support trenches, usually located several hundred yards to the rear. These positions housed reserves, ammunition supplies, and command posts. Still further back were the reserve trenches, where troops could rest between periods of duty in the front lines. All of these positions were connected by communication trenches that allowed soldiers to move safely without exposing themselves to enemy fire. The area between opposing trench lines became known as no man's land, a desolate stretch of ground that could vary from 50 yards to several hundred yards in width. This dangerous space was marked by shell craters, barbed wire entanglements, and the debris of war. During daylight hours, any movement in no man's land meant almost certain death from sniper fire or machine guns. The first winter of the war brought unique challenges that no army had anticipated when the conflict began. The soldiers who had marched off to war in August, wearing summer uniforms, now faced the cold and wet of a continental winter in improvised shelters. The trenches, which had been dug hastily during the autumn fighting, were poorly prepared for winter weather. Rain turned the trenches into rivers of mud, while frost made the ground as hard as concrete. Soldiers suffered from exposure, frostbite, and a variety of ailments that came from living in cold, damp conditions without adequate shelter or sanitation. The condition known as trench foot, caused by prolonged exposure to cold and dampness, became a serious medical problem that affected thousands of soldiers. The problem of disposing of human waste in the trenches created serious health hazards that military engineers had never before encountered. Traditional field sanitation, which relied on soldiers burying waste at a safe distance from their positions, was impossible when movement outside the trenches meant certain death. Latrines had to be constructed within the trench systems, creating conditions that promoted the spread of disease and created terrible odors that made life even more unpleasant. Rats became a particular plague in the trenches, attracted by food scraps and human remains that could not be properly disposed of. These animals, some growing to enormous size on the abundant food supply, became symbols of the degraded conditions in which the soldiers lived. The constant battle against rats, lice, and other vermin became as much a part of trench warfare as the struggle against the human enemy. Yet despite these horrible conditions, or perhaps because of them, the soldiers developed a remarkable resilience and adaptability that would characterize the entire war. Humor became a crucial defense mechanism against the horrors of war, while superstition and ritual provided psychological comfort in situations where rational thought offered little hope. Lucky charms, religious medals, and personal totems became precious possessions that soldiers carried into battle as protection against the random violence that surrounded them. The development of a distinctive trench culture began during this first winter and would evolve throughout the war. Soldiers developed their own slang and terminology to describe their experiences. The area between trenches became no man's land. Dangerous corners were given nicknames like Dead Man's Corner or Hellfire Corner, and familiar landmarks acquired names that reflected the soldiers' dark humor and their need to make sense of an incomprehensible situation. the daily routine of trench warfare was dictated by the need to avoid enemy fire during daylight hours. Most activity took place at night, when soldiers could move relatively safely between positions, repair damaged defenses, and bring up supplies from the rear areas. Dawn and dusk were particularly dangerous times, as these were the hours when attacks were most likely to be launched and when soldiers had to maintain their highest level of alertness. The ritual of Stand To became a defining feature of trench warfare. At dawn and dusk, all soldiers would man their positions with weapons ready, prepared to repel any surprise attack. Between these periods of high alert, the day was filled with maintenance tasks: cleaning weapons, repairing trenches, writing letters home, and trying to catch what sleep was possible despite the constant noise of artillery and rifle fire. Mail from home became a vital lifeline that connected the soldiers to the world they had left behind. Letters brought news of families, friends, and the small events of civilian life that seemed both incredibly important and strangely remote from the reality of the trenches. Packages from home, containing food, tobacco, warm clothing, and other comforts, were shared among comrades and provided tangible evidence that they had not been forgotten by those they were fighting to protect. The censorship system that monitored soldiers' correspondence was designed to prevent military information from reaching the enemy. But it also served to maintain morale on the home front by filtering out the most disturbing descriptions of battlefield conditions. Soldiers learned to write in a careful code that their families could understand, while avoiding explicit descriptions that would be deleted by military censors. Yet it was during this first winter that one of the most remarkable and touching events of the entire war took place. On Christmas Eve 1914, German soldiers in trenches near the Belgian town of Ypres began placing candles on their parapets and singing traditional Christmas carols. British soldiers in the opposing trenches, initially suspicious, gradually responded with carols of their own, and slowly, cautiously, men from both sides began emerging from their trenches to meet in the dangerous no-man's land between their positions. The Christmas truce was not a single coordinated event, but rather a series of spontaneous local ceasefires that occurred along various parts of the front. Soldiers exchanged gifts of tobacco, chocolate, and small souvenirs, while some areas witnessed impromptu football matches between British and German troops. Photographs were taken, addresses exchanged, and for a few precious hours, the common humanity of the soldiers overcame the artificial hatred promoted by their governments. In some sectors, the truce lasted only a few hours, while in others it continued for several days. Soldiers took advantage of the ceasefire to bury their dead, repair their defenses, and simply experience a few moments of peace in a war that seemed to have no end. The truce provided a brief glimpse of what might have been possible if reason and compassion had prevailed over national ambition and military necessity. High command on both sides were deeply alarmed by the fraternization and issued strict orders that such truces were not to be repeated. The war was too serious and the stakes too high to allow sentiment to interfere with military discipline and the prosecution of the war. Future Christmas seasons would pass without similar displays of common humanity, as the war became increasingly bitter and the gulf between enemies widened. The Christmas truce of 1914 would be remembered as the last moment when the soldiers of opposing armies could see each other as fellow human beings rather than as enemies to be destroyed. It marked the end of an era when war could still be conducted with a degree of civility and respect for the enemy. The war that continued after Christmas would be increasingly mechanized, impersonal, and brutal. While the Western Front settled into the static deadlock of trench warfare, the war in the East maintained more of its original mobile character. The vast distances involved and the lower density of forces made it impossible to create a continuous line of trenches from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Instead, the Eastern Front remained a war of movement, though movement that was often slow and costly due to the primitive transportation infrastructure and harsh weather conditions. The initial Russian invasion of East Prussia had ended in disaster at Tannenberg, but Russian forces achieved greater success against Austria-Hungary in the southern theatre. The Battle of Galicia, fought in late August and early September, saw Russian armies defeat Austrian forces and capture the important fortress city of Lemberg. These victories established Russian control over much of Galicia and forced Austria-Hungary to divert forces from the Serbian front to defend its own territory. The Austrian offensive against Serbia, which had been the original cause of the war, quickly bogged down as Serbian forces proved more resilient than Austrian planners had expected. The rugged terrain of the Balkans favored defensive operations, while Serbian soldiers fought with the desperation of men defending their homeland against foreign invaders. The expected quick victory became a prolonged and costly campaign that drained Austrian resources and revealed the empire's military weaknesses. Serbian resistance was particularly fierce because the conflict was seen not merely as a war between states, but as a struggle for national survival. The small Serbian army, though outnumbered and outgunned, fought with remarkable tenacity and skill. Serbian successes against the much larger Austrian army became a source of inspiration for other small nations, and demonstrated that military technology alone could not guarantee victory against a determined defender. At sea, the war took on characteristics that would become increasingly important as the conflict continued. The British Royal Navy, the most powerful naval force in the world, implemented a distant blockade of Germany and Austria-Hungary. Using their control of the exits from the North Sea and their dominance of the world's shipping lanes, the British began to restrict the flow of goods to the Central Powers. This naval blockade, while initially less dramatic than the fighting on land, would eventually become one of the most effective weapons in the Allied arsenal. By controlling access to essential raw materials and food supplies, the British blockade began to create shortages that would eventually affect every aspect of life in Germany and Austria-Hungary. The blockade operated according to international law, but its effects would prove increasingly severe as the war continued. Germany responded to the British blockade with its own innovative naval campaign, using submarines to attack merchant shipping bound for Allied ports. The first submarine attacks were conducted according to traditional rules of warfare, with U-boats surfacing to warn merchant vessels before attacking and allowing crews to escape in lifeboats. However, the vulnerability of submarines when surfaced gradually led to a more ruthless approach that would eventually bring neutral nations into the conflict. The development of submarine warfare represented a fundamental change in naval strategy. Traditional naval battles between surface fleets became less important than the struggle to control merchant shipping. The submarine, a weapon that had been considered primarily useful for coastal defense, became a strategic weapon capable of threatening the global trade that sustained modern industrial economies. The Battle of Coronel, fought off the coast of Chile on November 1, 1914, saw a German cruiser squadron defeat a British naval force, demonstrating that the war at sea would not be entirely one-sided, despite overwhelming British naval superiority. The German victory was a shock to British public opinion, which had assumed that the Royal Navy would quickly establish complete control of the world's oceans. However, the German triumph at Coronel was short-lived. British reinforcements were quickly dispatched to the South Atlantic, and on December 8th, the German squadron was intercepted and destroyed at the Battle of the Falkland Islands. The defeat eliminated German surface naval power outside European waters and demonstrated the global reach of British naval strength. These early naval encounters established patterns that would characterize the war at sea throughout the conflict. The British would maintain overall control of the surface of the oceans through their superior numbers of battleships and cruisers, while the Germans would increasingly rely on submarine warfare to disrupt Allied shipping and challenge British naval supremacy through stealth rather than direct confrontation. The entry of the Ottoman Empire into the war in November 1914 further complicated the global conflict by opening new theaters of operations in the Middle East and the Caucasus. The decision to join the Central Powers was made by the Young Turk leadership, particularly War Minister Enver Pasha, who believed that alliance with Germany offered the best hope of recovering territories lost to Russia in previous wars and of modernizing the declining Ottoman state. The Turkish decision brought Britain and France into direct conflict with the Ottoman Empire, creating new strategic challenges and opportunities. British control of Egypt and the strategically vital Suez Canal was now threatened by Turkish forces, while the possibility of opening a new front against Germany's allies seemed to offer hope of breaking the deadlock that was developing on the Western Front. The Ottoman entry into the war also had significant implications for Russia, which now faced the threat of attack from the south through the Caucasus Mountains. Russian forces in this region would have to be diverted from operations against Germany and Austria-Hungary, further complicating Russian strategic planning and reducing the pressure on the Central Powers. As 1914 drew to a close, it was clear that the expectations of a short, decisive war had been completely mistaken. The great battles of the opening months had settled nothing definitively, while the terrible casualties had only begun to hint at the enormous price that would eventually be paid for victory. The German invasion of France had been stopped, but German forces still occupied most of Belgium and much of northern France. Russian forces had suffered defeat in East Prussia, but were advancing successfully in Galicia, while Austria-Hungary's attempt to crush Serbia had ended in humiliating failure that damaged the empire's prestige throughout the Balkans. The war that had begun with such confidence and popular enthusiasm was already revealing characteristics that would define the entire conflict. Industrial production was becoming as important as military skill and traditional battlefield tactics, while the ability to sustain heavy casualties over extended periods was proving more decisive than brilliant generalship or individual acts of heroism. The comfortable assumptions of European civilization about progress, rationality, and the essential goodness of human nature were beginning to crumble under the weight of a conflict that seemed to demand everything from the nations that waged it. The transformation of warfare itself became evident in these early months of fighting. The rifled firearms and rapid-fire artillery that had been perfected in the late 19th century gave defensive forces enormous advantages over attackers advancing across open ground. A single machine gun, properly positioned and supplied with adequate ammunition, could stop entire battalions of infantry attempting to advance across the killing fields of no man's land. Artillery pieces, guided by telephone communication and aerial observation, could deliver devastating barrages with unprecedented accuracy and destructive power. These technological realities began to reshape military thinking, even as the first year of war drew to its close. The cavalry charges that had dominated European military imagination for centuries proved not only ineffective, but suicidal against modern weapons. The colorful uniforms that had distinguished different armies, the bright red trousers of French infantry, the distinctive spiked helmets of German soldiers, the elaborate dress uniforms of Austrian hussars, gave way to practical field gray and khaki colors that provided better camouflage on the modern battlefield. The home fronts of the warring nations also began to experience changes that no one had anticipated when the war began with such optimism in August. The departure of millions of men for military service left significant gaps in the civilian workforce that were gradually filled by women, elderly workers, and men previously considered unfit for industrial labor. Factories that had produced consumer goods were systematically converted to military production, while entirely new industries emerged to meet the unprecedented demand for shells, rifles, machine guns, and other military equipment. The financial cost of the war quickly exceeded all previous historical experience. Governments that had operated on peacetime budgets measured in millions now found themselves spending billions on military operations. Traditional methods of government finance proved completely inadequate, forcing nations to resort to extensive borrowing, printing paper money, and imposing new taxes that would have been politically unthinkable in peacetime. Yet perhaps the most profound change was in the realm of ideas, expectations, and fundamental assumptions about human nature and society. The optimistic belief in inevitable human progress that had characterized the early years of the century began to give way to a darker, more pessimistic understanding of human nature and the fragility of civilized society. The easy confidence that rational men could always solve international disputes through patient negotiation and reasonable compromise was being replaced by a grim recognition that some conflicts could only be resolved through the sustained application of overwhelming force. The propaganda machines of the various warring nations worked tirelessly to maintain public support for the war effort and to sustain morale during the difficult winter months. Newspapers that had once competed to provide objective, balanced reporting now became willing instruments of national policy, presenting carefully edited versions of military events that emphasized victories while minimizing or ignoring defeats and setbacks. Poster artists created powerful images that portrayed the enemy as brutal and inhuman, while depicting their own soldiers as heroic defenders of civilization and moral values. Children in schools throughout Europe learned new songs that celebrated military heroes and mocked enemy leaders with crude humor. The German Kaiser, once widely respected as the beloved grandson of Queen Victoria and a fellow monarch, became a figure of ridicule and hatred in British popular culture. French children were systematically taught to hate the Boche, who had invaded their sacred homeland, while German students learned about the perfidious Albion that had supposedly betrayed its natural cultural kinship with Germany by siding with Germany's enemies. Yet beneath this carefully orchestrated surface of patriotic enthusiasm and national unity, more thoughtful observers were beginning to recognize that the war was fundamentally changing European society in ways that might prove irreversible. The old certainties about social hierarchy, the effectiveness of international law, and the inevitability of human progress were being systematically questioned by the daily reality of industrial-scale killing and destruction. Letters from soldiers at the front began to reveal the growing gap between official propaganda and the harsh realities of battlefield conditions. The heroic cavalry charges celebrated in newspaper accounts bore little resemblance to the muddy, terrifying, and ultimately futile experience of infantry attacks against well-positioned machine gun nests. The clean, decisive victories described by military spokesmen and war correspondents contrasted sharply with the confused, bloody, and inconclusive encounters that characterized most actual combat operations. Families anxiously waiting for news from the front learned to read carefully between the lines of official casualty reports and military communiques. Euphemistic terms like missing in action and lightly wounded covered a multitude of horrors that could not be accurately described in letters that had to pass through strict military censorship. The steady stream of hospital trains arriving at railway stations throughout Europe provided more accurate information about the war's true progress and cost than any newspaper account or government announcement. The medical profession throughout Europe faced unprecedented challenges that no previous conflict had presented to doctors and nurses. The wounds caused by modern high-explosive weapons were more severe and complex than anything medical professionals had encountered in previous wars. High-explosive artillery shells created traumatic injuries that required entirely new surgical techniques and procedures, while the sheer number of casualties quickly overwhelmed medical services that had been designed for peacetime conditions and much smaller patient loads. Innovations in medical treatment, driven by desperate necessity and the urgent need to save lives, began to save soldiers who would certainly have died in earlier conflicts. The systematic use of antiseptics, improved understanding of infection and disease transmission, and better organization of medical evacuation procedures all contributed to reducing the death rate among wounded soldiers. Yet these significant medical advances could do nothing to address the psychological trauma that began to manifest itself as shell shock among soldiers who had witnessed too much horror and violence. The winter of 1914–15 also witnessed the beginning of what would become one of the war's most distinctive and historically significant features: the systematic involvement of civilian populations in ways that previous conflicts had never required or imagined. The British naval blockade of Germany meant that ordinary German citizens began to experience serious shortages of food and other essential consumer goods. Rationing systems were introduced that regulated everything from bread and meat to soap and clothing, while ersatz products made from substitute materials became increasingly common in German households as traditional imports became unavailable. The British Isles, protected by the powerful Royal Navy from the possibility of invasion, nevertheless felt the war's impact profoundly through the departure of hundreds of thousands of sons and husbands for military service. The long-established British tradition of voluntary military enlistment meant that recruiting officers appeared in towns and villages throughout the country, appealing to young men's sense of patriotic duty and promising them adventure and glory. The famous recruitment poster featuring Lord Kitchener pointing directly at the viewer with the compelling caption, "Your country needs you," became one of the most recognizable and effective images of the entire war. France, with German armies occupying some of its most economically important and industrialized regions, faced the particular challenge of maintaining war production, while large areas of the country remained under enemy control. The textile mills of northern France, the vital coal mines of the Pas-de-Calais region, the important iron foundries of Lorraine, all were either completely destroyed by military action or cut off from the rest of the country by the front lines. French industry had to be systematically rebuilt and relocated to areas that had never been centers of heavy production, using workers who had never seen the inside of a modern factory. Russia, with its vast territory and enormous population, initially seemed best positioned to sustain a prolonged war of attrition, yet the Russian Empire also faced unique and potentially fatal challenges. The country's limited and primitive railway network made it extremely difficult to move troops and essential supplies over the enormous distances involved in military operations on multiple fronts. The industrial base, capable of producing modern weapons and military equipment, was concentrated in just a few major cities, while the vast majority of the population remained engaged in subsistence agriculture, using methods that had changed little since medieval times. The multinational character of the Austro-Hungarian Empire created particular problems as the war continued and casualties mounted. Czech soldiers fighting in Austrian uniforms often had little genuine enthusiasm for a war that seemed to serve primarily German and Hungarian interests rather than their own. Polish soldiers found themselves in the tragic situation of fighting on both sides of the conflict, since Poland had been divided between Austria-Hungary, Germany and Russia in the late 18th century, and Polish men owed military service to whichever empire controlled their particular region. South Slavic soldiers in Austrian service faced the uncomfortable moral reality that they were fighting against Serbia, which many of them regarded as their natural homeland and the legitimate leader of South Slavic aspirations for independence. The Ottoman Empire's momentous decision to enter the war in November 1914 on the side of the Central Powers further complicated the global conflict by opening entirely new theaters of military operations in the strategically important Middle East and the mountainous Caucasus region. The decision to join Germany and Austria-Hungary was made primarily by the young Turk leadership, particularly the ambitious war minister Enver Pasha, who believed that alliance with the most powerful military force in Europe offered the best hope of recovering territories previously lost to Russia and of modernizing the declining Ottoman state through German technical assistance and military support. The Turkish decision to enter the war brought Britain and France into direct military conflict with the Ottoman Empire for the first time in decades, creating entirely new strategic challenges and potentially promising opportunities. British control of Egypt and the strategically vital Suez Canal, the crucial link between Europe and the British Empire in Asia, was now directly threatened by Turkish forces operating from bases in Palestine and Syria. At the same time, the possibility of opening a significant new front against Germany's allies seemed to offer some hope of breaking the frustrating deadlock that was rapidly developing on the stalemated Western Front. The Ottoman entry into the war also had serious implications for Russia, which now faced the realistic threat of attack from the south through the difficult terrain of the Caucasus Mountains. Russian military forces in this remote region would have to be diverted from operations against Germany and Austria-Hungary, further complicating Russian strategic planning and reducing the military pressure on the Central Powers at a time when every available soldier was desperately needed. As the year 1914 drew to its cold, dark close, it had become painfully clear to all objective observers that the confident expectations of a short, decisive war had been completely and tragically mistaken. The great battles of the opening months, Tannenberg, the Marne, the race to the sea, had settled nothing definitively, while the terrible casualties suffered by all sides had only begun to hint at the enormous human price that would eventually be paid for whatever victory might eventually be achieved. The German invasion of France had been stopped and turned back, but German forces still occupied most of Belgium and substantial portions of northern France. Russian forces had suffered humiliating defeat in East Prussia, but were advancing successfully in Galicia against Austrian forces, while Austria-Hungary's confident attempt to crush Serbia quickly had ended in embarrassing failure that damaged the empire's military prestige throughout the volatile Balkans. The war that had begun in August with such widespread confidence and genuine popular enthusiasm was already revealing fundamental characteristics that would define the entire conflict and distinguish it from all previous wars in human history. Industrial production capacity was rapidly becoming as important as traditional military skill and battlefield tactics, while the ability of entire populations to sustain heavy casualties over extended periods was proven more decisive than brilliant generalship or individual acts of heroism. The comfortable assumptions of European civilization about inevitable progress, human rationality, and the essential goodness of human nature were beginning to crumble under the enormous weight of a conflict that seemed to demand everything from the nations that waged it. The fundamental transformation of warfare itself became increasingly evident during these crucial early months of fighting. The rifled firearms and rapid-fire artillery pieces that had been perfected by military engineers in the late 19th century gave defensive forces overwhelming advantages over attackers who had to advance across open ground under direct observation and fire. A single machine gun, properly positioned in a concealed location and supplied with adequate ammunition, could stop entire battalions of brave infantry attempting to advance across the deadly killing fields of no man's land. Modern artillery pieces, guided by telephone communication and increasingly sophisticated aerial observation, could deliver devastatingly accurate barrages with unprecedented destructive power that made traditional military formations and tactics obsolete overnight. These harsh technological realities began to reshape fundamental military thinking and doctrine even as the first year of war drew to its inconclusive close. The romantic cavalry charges that had dominated European military imagination and planning for centuries proved not only completely ineffective, but utterly suicidal when attempted against modern defensive weapons and positions. The colorful traditional uniforms that had distinguished different national armies for generations, the bright red trousers of French infantry, the distinctive spiked helmets of German soldiers, the elaborate dress uniforms of Austrian hussars, were rapidly abandoned in favor of practical field gray and khaki colors that provided much better camouflage and concealment on the modern battlefield. The home fronts of all the warring nations also began to experience profound social and economic changes that no political leader or military planner had anticipated when the war began with such optimism in August. The systematic departure of millions of men for military service left enormous gaps in the civilian workforce that were gradually filled by women entering industrial employment for the first time, elderly workers returning to factories, and men previously considered physically unfit for industrial labor. Factories that had produced consumer goods and luxury items were systematically converted to military production, while entirely new industries emerged almost overnight to meet the unprecedented and seemingly insatiable demand for artillery shells, rifles, machine guns, and countless other items of military equipment. The staggering financial cost of modern industrialized warfare quickly exceeded all previous historical experience and challenged traditional assumptions about government finance and economic policy. Governments that had operated comfortable peacetime budgets, measured in millions of dollars, pounds, or marks, now found themselves spending billions on military operations and war materiel. Traditional methods of government finance proved completely inadequate to meet these enormous demands, forcing nations to resort to extensive borrowing from neutral countries, printing unprecedented quantities of paper money, and imposing entirely new categories of taxes that would have been politically unthinkable and economically devastating in peacetime conditions. Yet perhaps the most profound and lasting change was occurring in the realm of ideas, expectations, and fundamental assumptions about human nature and the organization of civilized society. The optimistic belief in inevitable human progress and the perfectibility of social institutions that had characterized the confident early years of the 20th century. The 20th century began to give way to a much darker and more pessimistic understanding of human nature and the essential fragility of civilized society. The easy confidence that rational, educated men could always solve complex international disputes through patient negotiation and reasonable compromise was being systematically replaced by a grim recognition that some fundamental conflicts could only be resolved through the sustained application of overwhelming military force. The increasingly sophisticated propaganda machines of all the warring nations worked tirelessly throughout the winter months to maintain essential public support for the war effort and to sustain civilian morale during the difficult period of adjustment to wartime conditions. Newspapers that had once competed vigorously to provide objective, balanced reporting of international events now became willing and enthusiastic instruments of national policy, presenting carefully edited and often deliberately misleading versions of military events that consistently emphasized victories and successes, while systematically minimizing or completely ignoring defeats, setbacks, and embarrassing failures. Talented poster artists throughout Europe created increasingly powerful and emotionally manipulative images that consistently portrayed the enemy as brutal, inhuman, and morally depraved, while depicting their own national soldiers as heroic defenders of civilization, moral values, and everything decent in human society. These propaganda campaigns were remarkably successful in shaping public opinion and maintaining support for the war effort, but they also contributed to a dangerous escalation of hatred and misunderstanding between nations that had previously maintained relatively civilized diplomatic relations. Children in schools throughout Europe learned new patriotic songs that celebrated military heroes and mocked enemy leaders with increasingly crude and dehumanizing humor. The German Kaiser Wilhelm II, once widely respected throughout Europe as the beloved grandson of the late Queen Victoria and a fellow Christian monarch, became a figure of ridicule and intense personal hatred in British popular culture. French children were systematically taught to hate the Boche, who had brutally invaded their sacred homeland and committed terrible atrocities against innocent civilians, while German students learned about the supposedly perfidious Albion that had treacherously betrayed its natural cultural kinship with Germany by forming alliances with Germany's traditional enemies. Yet beneath this carefully orchestrated surface of patriotic enthusiasm and apparent national unity, more thoughtful and perceptive observers were beginning to recognize that the war was fundamentally changing European society in ways that might prove completely irreversible and permanently damaging to the foundations of civilized life. The old certainties about established social hierarchy, the effectiveness of international law in preventing conflicts, and the supposed inevitability of human progress were being systematically questioned and undermined by the daily reality of industrial-scale killing and systematic destruction of everything that previous generations had worked to build and preserve. Personal letters from soldiers serving at the front began to reveal the steadily growing gap between official propaganda accounts and the harsh, terrifying realities of actual battlefield conditions. the heroic cavalry charges and glorious infantry advances celebrated in newspaper accounts and official communiques bore little resemblance to the muddy, terrifying, and ultimately futile experience of infantry attacks against well-positioned machine gun nests and carefully prepared defensive positions. The clean, decisive victories described by military spokesmen and embedded war correspondents contrasted sharply with the confused, bloody, and generally inconclusive encounters that characterized most actual combat operations along the stabilizing front lines. Anxious families waiting desperately for news from the front learned to read very carefully between the lines of official casualty reports and military communiques that were carefully crafted to minimize public alarm and maintain morale. Euphemistic military terms like missing in action and lightly wounded covered a vast multitude of horrors that could not be accurately described in personal letters that had to pass through increasingly strict military censorship, designed to prevent sensitive information from reaching enemy intelligence services. The steady, seemingly endless stream of hospital trains arriving at railway stations throughout Europe provided much more accurate information about the war's true progress and human cost than any newspaper account or official government announcement. The medical profession throughout Europe faced entirely unprecedented challenges that no previous conflict in human history had presented to doctors, nurses, and medical administrators. The catastrophic wounds caused by modern high-explosive weapons and rapid-fire artillery were far more severe and medically complex than anything that medical professionals had encountered in previous wars or during their peacetime training. High-explosive artillery shells created traumatic injuries that required entirely new surgical techniques and procedures that had to be developed through tragic trial and error, while the sheer number of casualties arriving at field hospitals quickly overwhelmed medical services that had been designed for peacetime conditions and much smaller patient loads. Remarkable innovations in medical treatment, driven by desperate necessity and the urgent humanitarian need to save as many lives as possible, did begin to save soldiers who would certainly have died in earlier conflicts. The systematic use of antiseptics and sterilization procedures significantly improved understanding of infection and disease transmission, and much better organization of medical evacuation procedures all contributed meaningfully to reducing the death rate among wounded soldiers who reached medical facilities alive. Yet even these significant medical advances could do absolutely nothing to address the severe psychological trauma that began to manifest itself as shell shock among soldiers who had witnessed far too much horror, violence, and senseless death. The long, cold winter of 1914-15 also witnessed the gradual beginning of what would eventually become one of the war's most distinctive and historically significant features: the systematic involvement of entire civilian populations in ways that no previous conflict had ever required or even imagined possible. The increasingly effective British naval blockade of Germany and Austria-Hungary meant that ordinary German and Austrian citizens began to experience increasingly serious shortages of food and other essential consumer goods that had previously been taken for granted. Complex rationing systems were introduced that carefully regulated everything from bread and meat to soap and clothing, while hastily developed ersatz products made from substitute materials became increasingly common in German and Austrian households, as traditional imports became completely unavailable due to the naval blockade. The British Isles, effectively protected by the dominant Royal Navy from any realistic possibility of German invasion, nevertheless felt the war's profound impact through the systematic departure of hundreds of thousands of sons, husbands and fathers for military service on the continent. The long-established and deeply treasured British tradition of voluntary military enlistment, as opposed to continental conscription systems, meant that military recruiting officers appeared in towns and villages throughout the United Kingdom, making emotional appeals to young men's sense of patriotic duty while promising them adventure, glory, and the chance to serve their country in its hour of greatest need. The famous recruitment poster, featuring the stern visage of Lord Kitchener, pointing directly at the viewer with the compelling caption, "Your country needs you," became one of the most recognizable and psychologically effective images of the entire war, inspiring thousands of young men to abandon their civilian occupations and join the rapidly expanding British Army. France, with substantial German armies occupying some of its most economically important and heavily industrialized regions, faced the particularly daunting challenge of maintaining essential war production, while large areas of the country remained under direct enemy control and administration. The vital textile mills of northern France, the absolutely crucial coal mines of the Pas-de-Calais region, the strategically important iron foundries and steel mills of Lorraine, all were either completely destroyed by military action and artillery bombardment, or effectively cut off from the rest of the country by the stabilizing front lines. French industrial capacity had to be systematically rebuilt and relocated to southern and western regions that had never previously been centers of heavy production, using hastily trained workers who had never seen the inside of a modern factory or operated complex industrial machinery. Russia, with its vast territorial expanse and enormous population that seemed to offer unlimited reserves of manpower, initially appeared to be best positioned among all the combatant nations to sustain a prolonged war of attrition and gradual exhaustion. Yet the Russian Empire also faced unique and potentially fatal structural challenges that became increasingly apparent as the conflict continued. The country's severely limited and technologically primitive railway network made it extremely difficult to move troops and essential military supplies over the enormous distances involved in coordinating military operations on multiple, widely separated fronts. The industrial base actually capable of producing modern weapons and sophisticated military equipment was concentrated in just a few major cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow, while the vast majority of the population remained engaged in traditional subsistence agriculture, using farming methods and rural technologies that had changed remarkably little since medieval times. The complex multinational character of the Austro-Hungarian Empire created increasingly serious internal problems as the war continued and military casualties mounted steadily. Czech soldiers fighting in Austrian uniforms often demonstrated little genuine enthusiasm for a war that seemed to serve primarily German and Hungarian national interests, rather than addressing Czech aspirations for greater autonomy or independence. Polish soldiers throughout the region found themselves in the particularly tragic and morally complex situation of fighting on opposing sides of the same conflict, since the ancient kingdom of Poland had been systematically divided between Austria-Hungary, Germany and Russia during the late 18th century, and Polish men owed military service to whichever empire happened to control their particular region of birth. South Slavic soldiers serving in Austrian military units faced the increasingly uncomfortable moral reality that they were actively fighting against Serbia, which many of them regarded as their natural homeland and the legitimate leader of South Slavic aspirations for political independence and cultural autonomy. The Ottoman Empire's momentous and strategically significant decision to enter the war in November 1914 on the side of the Central Powers further complicated and globalized the conflict by opening entirely new theaters of military operations in the strategically vital Middle East and the remote, mountainous Caucasus region. The crucial decision to join Germany and Austria-Hungary was made primarily by the revolutionary Young Turk leadership, particularly the ambitious and German-influenced War Minister Enver Pasha, who genuinely believed that a military alliance with the most powerful and technologically advanced military force in Europe offered the Ottoman Empire its best realistic hope of recovering valuable territories previously lost to Russian expansion, while simultaneously modernizing the declining Ottoman state through extensive German technical assistance, military advisors, and financial support. The momentous Turkish decision to enter the war brought Britain and France into direct military conflict with the Ottoman Empire for the first time in several decades, creating entirely new strategic challenges while potentially offering promising new opportunities for breaking the developing stalemate. British control of Egypt and the strategically vital Suez Canal, absolutely crucial as the primary link between Europe and the extensive British Empire in Asia, was now directly threatened by substantial Turkish forces operating from well-established bases in Palestine and Syria. At the same time, the realistic possibility of opening a significant new military front against Germany's allies seemed to offer some genuine hope of breaking the increasingly frustrating deadlock that was rapidly developing along the heavily fortified Western Front. The Ottoman entry into the global conflict also had serious and immediate implications for Russia's strategic position, since the Russian Empire now faced the realistic threat of a major attack from the south through the difficult and mountainous terrain of the Caucasus region. Substantial Russian military forces in this remote area would necessarily have to be diverted from active operations against Germany and Austria-Hungary, further complicating Russian strategic planning and significantly reducing the military pressure on the Central Powers at precisely the time when every available soldier was desperately needed to maintain the initiative on multiple active fronts. As the year 1914 drew to its cold, dark, and increasingly pessimistic close, it had become painfully and undeniably clear to all honest and objective observers that the confident expectations of a short, decisive war that would be concluded by Christmas had been completely and tragically mistaken. The great battles of the dramatic opening months, the devastating defeat at Tannenberg, The crucial turning point at the Marne, the desperate race to the sea, had settled absolutely nothing definitively, while the already terrible casualties suffered by all combatant nations had only begun to hint at the truly enormous human price that would eventually be paid for whatever form of victory might eventually be achieved through continued fighting. The ambitious German invasion of France had been stopped and turned back from the gates of Paris, but substantial German forces still occupied most of Belgium and considerable portions of the most economically productive regions of northern France. Russian forces had suffered humiliating and costly defeat in East Prussia, but were simultaneously advancing successfully in Galicia against increasingly desperate Austrian forces, while Austria-Hungary's confident attempt to crush small Serbia quickly and decisively had ended in embarrassing military failure that seriously damaged the empire's military prestige and political credibility throughout the volatile and ethnically complex Balkans region. The war that had begun in August with such widespread confidence and genuine popular enthusiasm was already revealing fundamental characteristics that would ultimately define the entire conflict and distinguish it permanently from all previous wars in recorded human history. Industrial production capacity and economic organization were rapidly becoming as strategically important as traditional military skill and classical battlefield tactics, while the ability of entire national populations to sustain heavy casualties over extended periods was proving more operationally decisive than brilliant generalship or inspiring individual acts of heroism. The comfortable and optimistic assumptions of European civilization about inevitable human progress, the fundamental rationality of human behavior, and the essential goodness of human nature were beginning to crumble systematically under the enormous weight and moral pressure of a conflict that seemed to demand everything from the nations and peoples that waged it. The fundamental transformation of warfare itself became increasingly evident and undeniable during these crucial early months of fighting that established patterns for the entire conflict. The rifled firearms and rapid-fire artillery pieces that had been perfected by military engineers and weapons manufacturers during the late 19th century gave defensive forces overwhelming and nearly insurmountable advantages over attacking forces that had to advance across open ground under direct observation and concentrated fire. A single machine gun, properly positioned in a concealed and protected location and supplied with adequate ammunition reserves, could stop entire battalions of brave and determined infantry attempting to advance across the deadly killing fields of no man's land. Modern artillery pieces, guided by reliable telephone communication and increasingly sophisticated aerial observation techniques, could deliver devastatingly accurate barrages with unprecedented destructive power that made traditional military formations and tactical approaches completely obsolete overnight. These harsh technological realities began to reshape fundamental military thinking and strategic doctrine even as the first year of war drew to its inconclusive and disappointing close. The romantic cavalry charges that had dominated European military imagination and strategic planning for centuries proved not only completely ineffective in practice, but utterly suicidal when attempted against modern defensive weapons and carefully prepared positions. The colorful and traditional uniforms that had distinguished different national armies for many generations, the bright red trousers of French infantry that made excellent targets, the distinctive spiked helmets of German soldiers that caught sunlight, the elaborate dress uniforms of Austrian hussars designed for parade rather than combat, were rapidly abandoned in favor of practical field gray and khaki colors that provided much better camouflage and concealment on the increasingly deadly modern battlefield. The home fronts of all the warring nations also began to experience profound social and economic changes that no political leader, military planner, or economic theorist had anticipated when the war began with such misplaced optimism in August. The systematic departure of millions of men for military service left enormous and potentially crippling gaps in the civilian workforce that were gradually filled by women entering industrial employment for the first time in history, elderly workers returning to factories they had left years earlier, and men previously considered physically unfit for demanding industrial labor. Factories that had produced consumer goods and luxury items for peacetime markets were systematically converted to military production, while entirely new industries emerged almost overnight to meet the unprecedented and seemingly insatiable wartime demand for artillery shells, rifles, machine guns, and countless other categories of military equipment and supplies. The staggering financial cost of modern industrialized warfare quickly exceeded all previous historical experience and fundamentally challenged traditional assumptions about government finance, monetary policy, and economic management. Governments that had operated comfortable peacetime budgets, carefully measured in millions of dollars, pounds, or marks, now found themselves spending many billions on military operations and war materiel that consumed national resources at unprecedented rates. Traditional methods of government finance proved completely inadequate to meet these enormous and constantly growing demands, forcing nations to resort to extensive borrowing from neutral countries and private investors, printing unprecedented quantities of paper money that threatened inflation, and imposing entirely new categories of taxes that would have been politically unthinkable and economically devastating under peacetime conditions. Yet perhaps the most profound and historically lasting change was occurring gradually in the realm of ideas, expectations, and fundamental assumptions about human nature and the proper organization of civilized society. The optimistic belief in inevitable human progress and the perfectibility of social institutions that had characterized the confident early years of the 20th century. The 20th century began to give way to a much darker and more pessimistic understanding of human nature and the essential fragility of civilized society. The easy confidence that rational, educated men could always solve complex international disputes through patient negotiation and reasonable compromise was being systematically replaced by a grim recognition that some fundamental conflicts of interest and national ambition could only be resolved through the sustained application of overwhelming military force and the systematic destruction of enemy capabilities. The increasingly sophisticated and psychologically manipulative propaganda machines of all the warring nations worked tirelessly throughout the long winter months to maintain essential public support for the war effort and to sustain civilian morale during the difficult period of adjustment to increasingly restrictive wartime conditions. Newspapers that had once competed vigorously to provide objective, balanced reporting of international events and domestic political developments now became willing and enthusiastic instruments of national policy, presenting carefully edited and often deliberately misleading versions of military events that consistently emphasized victories and successes while systematically minimizing or completely ignoring defeats, setbacks, and embarrassing military failures that might undermine public confidence. Talented poster artists throughout Europe created increasingly powerful and emotionally manipulative visual images that consistently portrayed the enemy as brutal, inhuman, and morally depraved, while depicting their own national soldiers as heroic defenders of civilization, moral values, and everything decent and worthwhile in human society. These carefully orchestrated propaganda campaigns were remarkably successful in shaping public opinion and maintaining popular support for the war effort. But they also contributed significantly to a dangerous escalation of hatred and fundamental misunderstanding between nations that had previously maintained relatively civilized diplomatic relations and had cooperated on many international issues. Children in schools throughout Europe learned entirely new patriotic songs that celebrated military heroes and mocked enemy leaders with increasingly crude and systematically dehumanizing humor designed to make the enemy seem less than human. The German Kaiser Wilhelm II, once widely respected throughout Europe as the beloved grandson of the late Queen Victoria and a fellow Christian monarch who had seemed to represent the civilized values of European royalty, became a figure of intense ridicule and personal hatred in British popular culture, depicted in cartoons as a monster threatening innocent civilians. French children were systematically taught to hate the Boche, who had brutally invaded their sacred homeland and committed terrible atrocities against innocent civilians, while German students learned about the supposedly perfidious Albion that had treacherously betrayed its natural cultural kinship with Germany by forming military alliances with Germany's traditional enemies and rivals. Yet beneath this carefully orchestrated surface of patriotic enthusiasm and apparent national unity, more thoughtful and perceptive observers were beginning to recognize that the war was fundamentally changing European society in ways that might prove completely irreversible and permanently damaging to the foundations of civilized life that had been built up over centuries of gradual progress. The old certainties about established social hierarchy, the effectiveness of international law in preventing conflicts between civilized nations, and the supposed inevitability of human progress toward greater understanding and cooperation were being systematically questioned and undermined by the daily reality of industrial-scale killing and the systematic destruction of everything that previous generations had worked to build and preserve for future generations. Personal letters from soldiers serving at the front began to reveal the steadily growing gap between official propaganda accounts and the harsh, terrifying realities of actual battlefield conditions that defied romantic description. The heroic cavalry charges and glorious infantry advances celebrated in newspaper accounts and official military communiques bore little resemblance to the muddy, terrifying, and ultimately futile experience of infantry attacks against well-positioned machine gun nests and carefully prepared defensive positions that dominated the landscape. The clean, decisive victories described by military spokesmen and carefully supervised war correspondents contrasted sharply with the confused, bloody, and generally inconclusive encounters that characterized most actual combat operations along the stabilizing front lines, where real soldiers lived and died. Anxious families, waiting desperately for reliable news from the front, learned to read very carefully between the lines of official casualty reports and military communiques that were carefully crafted by government censors to minimize public alarm and maintain civilian morale. Euphemistic military terms like missing in action and lightly wounded covered a vast multitude of horrors that could not be accurately described in personal letters that had to pass through increasingly strict military censorship specifically designed to prevent sensitive information from reaching enemy intelligence services while maintaining public support for the war effort. The steady, seemingly endless stream of hospital trains arriving at railway stations throughout Europe provided much more accurate and sobering information about the war's true progress and enormous human cost than any newspaper account or carefully worded official government announcement. The medical profession throughout Europe faced entirely unprecedented challenges that no previous conflict in human history had presented to doctors, nurses, and medical administrators struggling to cope with the reality of modern warfare. The catastrophic wounds caused by modern high-explosive weapons and rapid-fire artillery were far more severe and medically complex than anything that medical professionals had encountered in previous wars or during their peacetime training and education. High-explosive artillery shells created traumatic injuries that required entirely new surgical techniques and procedures that had to be developed through tragic trial and error, while the sheer number of casualties arriving continuously at field hospitals quickly overwhelmed medical services that had been designed for peacetime conditions and much smaller patient loads that could be handled with traditional methods. Remarkable innovations in medical treatment, driven by desperate necessity and the urgent humanitarian need to save as many lives as possible, did begin to save soldiers who would certainly have died in earlier conflicts fought with less destructive weapons. The systematic use of antiseptics and sterilization procedures significantly improved understanding of infection and disease transmission, and much better organization of medical evacuation procedures all contributed meaningfully to reducing the death rate among wounded soldiers who reached medical facilities alive and could receive proper treatment. Yet even these significant medical advances could do absolutely nothing to address the severe psychological trauma that began to manifest itself as shell shock among soldiers who had witnessed far too much horror, violence, and senseless death to maintain their psychological equilibrium. The long, cold winter of 1914 to 15 also witnessed the gradual beginning of what would eventually become one of the war's most distinctive and historically significant features: the systematic involvement of entire civilian populations in ways that no previous conflict had ever required or even imagined possible under traditional concepts of warfare. The increasingly effective British naval blockade of Germany and Austria-Hungary meant that ordinary German and Austrian citizens began to experience increasingly serious shortages of food and other essential consumer goods that had previously been taken for granted as readily available in peacetime markets. Complex rationing systems were introduced that carefully regulated everything from bread and meat to soap and clothing, while hastily developed ersatz products made from substitute materials became increasingly common in German and Austrian households, as traditional imports became completely unavailable due to the comprehensive naval blockade that controlled access to overseas suppliers. The British Isles, effectively protected by the dominant Royal Navy from any realistic possibility of German invasion or direct attack, nevertheless felt the war's profound impact through the systematic departure of hundreds of thousands of sons, husbands, and fathers for dangerous military service on the European continent. The long-established and deeply treasured British tradition of voluntary military enlistment, as opposed to the continental conscription systems that compelled military service, meant that military recruiting officers appeared in towns and villages throughout the United Kingdom, making increasingly emotional appeals to young men's sense of patriotic duty, while promising them adventure, glory, and the meaningful chance to serve their country in its hour of greatest need and danger. France, with substantial German armies occupying some of its most economically important and heavily industrialized regions, faced the particularly daunting challenge of maintaining essential war production, while large areas of the country remained under direct enemy control and military administration. The vital textile mills of northern France, the absolutely crucial coal mines of the Pas-de-Calais region, the strategically important iron foundries and steel mills of Lorraine, all were either completely destroyed by sustained artillery bombardment or effectively cut off from the rest of the country by the stabilizing front lines that divided France into occupied and free zones. French industrial capacity had to be systematically rebuilt and relocated to southern and western regions that had never previously been centers of heavy production, using hastily trained workers who had never seen the inside of a modern factory or operated the complex industrial machinery required for weapons production. As the first winter of this terrible conflict deepened and the harsh realities of a prolonged war became undeniable, the soldiers in their muddy trenches began to understand that they were participants in something far larger and more significant than a traditional European war. They were witnessing the end of one historical era and the violent birth of another, though they could not yet comprehend the full magnitude of the transformation they were experiencing. The comfortable world of 1914, with its optimistic assumptions about progress and civilization, was dying in the trenches of France and Belgium, and something entirely new and unprecedented was being born from its ashes. The Christmas truce of 1914 would be remembered by historians as perhaps the last moment when the essential humanity of the participants could overcome the machinery of modern war. Never again would such spontaneous displays of human fellowship occur between the opposing armies. The war that continued after that brief interlude of peace would become increasingly mechanized, impersonal, and brutal, consuming not just the soldiers who fought it, but the entire fabric of European civilization. As we conclude this first chapter of our gentle journey through the Great War, we leave the soldiers of all nations settling into their winter quarters along the Western Front, writing letters home by flickering candlelight, and wondering with growing apprehension what the approaching spring might bring. They could not know that they stood at the beginning of a fundamental transformation that would change everything they thought they knew about war, about civilization, and about the basic nature of human society and international relations. The coming storm had indeed arrived with devastating force, and in its violent wake would follow changes that would echo through the remainder of the 20th century and beyond, shaping the modern world in ways that are still felt today. The Age of Innocence, if it had ever truly existed, was ending forever in the muddy trenches of France and Belgium. The age of total war, with all its terrible implications for human civilization and the future of democratic society, had begun with consequences that would reshape the entire world. But that continuing story of transformation and tragedy, of endurance and ultimate resolution, is a tale for future nights as we continue our gentle exploration of history's most profound and consequential chapter. For now, rest peacefully, dear listeners, and let the quiet voices of the past carry you into restful sleep, even as we remember with gratitude and sorrow those who found so little peace during that first terrible winter of the Great War, when the old world died and a new one struggled to be born from the ashes of unprecedented destruction and unimaginable human suffering. The soldiers who settled into their winter quarters as 1914 became 1915 could not know that they were witnessing the end of one world and the birth of another. They knew only that they were cold, tired, and very far from home, committed to a struggle whose end they could not see, and whose meaning they were beginning to question with growing doubt and disillusionment. Yet they endured with remarkable courage and determination, because endurance was what the situation demanded, and because they had discovered reserves of strength and resilience they had not known they possessed. In their quiet endurance lay perhaps the most hopeful element in a situation that seemed to offer little ground for optimism or confidence in the future. Whatever else the war might ultimately destroy, it couldn't destroy the fundamental human capacity to survive and adapt under conditions that would have seemed completely impossible to previous generations of European civilization. And so, as the winter nights lengthened and the artillery continued its intermittent conversation across the desolate no-man's land, the soldiers settled into the rhythm of a new kind of war that would dominate their lives for years to come. They could not know that this rhythm would reshape the world in ways that would still be felt a century later, or that their experiences would fundamentally alter humanity's understanding of the nature of modern conflict and the terrible price of international ambition. They knew only that they were part of something larger than themselves, something that had begun in the sunlit streets of Sarajevo on a June morning and had led them to this muddy corner of France where they waited with growing resignation for whatever was to come. In their waiting, in their endurance, in their stubborn refusal to surrender hope despite all evidence that hope was increasingly futile, lay the seeds of whatever future would eventually emerge from the ruins of the world they had known and loved. The great storm that had been gathering over Europe since the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand had broken at last with unprecedented fury, and its effects would reshape not only the European continent, but the entire world for generations to come. The Age of Innocence, if it had ever truly existed outside the imagination of later generations, was ending forever. The age of total war, with all its terrible implications for human civilization and the fundamental nature of international relations, had begun with consequences that no one could have predicted or imagined in the optimistic summer of 1914. And so concludes our first gentle journey into the coming storm of the Great War. Rest well, dear listeners, as we pause here in the winter of 1914, when the world changed forever and humanity learned that some storms, once begun, must simply be endured until they finally pass, leaving the landscape forever altered in their wake.